That was crazy. Now we look at our scripture this morning and see that David is experiencing a lot of insanity in his own life, and this is new for me, doing this without a script, so I appreciate your patience with me here this morning. But David is experiencing a lot of strife in his life. And we don't normally see that in our cultural time, in our cultural place. We tend not to see that sort of context. I want to transport you now to the life of a seminarian, only slightly and only just an introductory look into the life of a seminarian. But we're going to do something called exegesis. Exegesis, when I was in local pastor's licensing school, was explained to me like you are exiting Jesus from the scripture and sharing it with the congregation. So that was my first understanding of exegesis. And the idea is that you look at a scripture and you see how it speaks to you and how God is speaking to you through this scripture, and that's how ideas in sermons are birthed. And so let's do a little exegesis, a little modern day exegesis on this passage from Psalms. You look at ideas, and let me get my scripture here. There's, what'll preach? I mean, imagine you're a fire and brimstone preacher looking at this passage. What sections are jumping out at you? I don't know. Evil doesn't live with you. You aren't a God who enjoys wickedness. You destroy liars. I mean, you get that. You sort of can pull these phrases out. And I mean, even when I started to do that, I started to channel a little bit of John Hagee in that. I hear the fire and brimstone in that. And that's what passes. Congratulations, you've had an introductory class into seminary exegesis. So give yourselves a little pat on the back after the service. But that's sort of what we do with Scripture now. We look at it and we take this little idea that'll preach, or that little idea. Yeah, that's a nice expression that preachers like to use. That'll preach. Yeah, that's how we look at Scripture. We look for the little snippets, maybe the verses, maybe a section of Scripture that agrees with my worldview. We look for that little. Some people call it proof texting, this and that, but it's we look for those ideas that I agree with most, and we hold on to that, or we try to use it as a cudgel to beat our opponents up with, or to beat someone we're having some sort of theological discussion with. We use that scripture, we pull these things out, and we use it to beat people over the heads. And if we would just take a little bit of time to look at the context of this scripture, we would understand it just a tad bit differently. Because if we look and we note in this scripture, we see that David isn't preaching a sermon in his royal court. This is not a sermon that David is preaching. There's certainly portions of the Psalms that can be construed as something that you can preach, but no, this is something wholly other than that. This is a prayer that David is praying. Pay attention to the sound of my cries, my King and my God, because I am praying to you. In the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I lay it out all before you, then I wait expectantly. That's the context of this scripture. It's a prayer. And so imagine, just personalize this for yourself for a moment. Personalize this and say, well, if I were David, how might I react? David was facing some pretty intense scrutiny, some pretty intense challenges to his throne. I mean, there were kings in other kingdoms who were plotting against him. There were generals in his armies who would say one thing and do another. There are people in his own kingdom that are plotting to kill him. He's facing some troubles. So what does he do? He does the same thing that we do, hopefully, for the most part, and in a lot of situations. We take those frustrations, we take these trials, we take we take the tumult in our lives and we go to God in prayer with it. And sometimes it can seem whiny, we're being the martyrs. Oh God, this person is such a challenge to deal with. I know I've been dealing with my mother-in-law for just the longest. She is so critical, and I can't. It feels like I'm drowning when I am around her. Or we got this person in my life, this person at work has made such a horrible mistake that it threatens not only their job, but my job as well. Or, my kids came home from school with a horrible report, or my kids just come home and said that my grandchild, my 14-year-old grandchild, is pregnant. God, what do I do? And it can sound like that. It can sound like maybe we're whining, but we notice what happens once David comes to God before prayer. It can start out like that. It started out, I've got all these problems, God. I've got all these horrible, terrible things that are happening to me. And I want you to imagine just for a second in your life, that your life is a symphony in minor. You imagine that dissonant sound that can take place, and it always happens at the scarier moments in movies or the more dramatic portions of movies. The score gets a little bit. It makes us anxious, or it does something to our emotions where it stirs us up, and it comes to this great crescendo, and then all of a sudden it stops, and it's just you. When we go to God in the midst of all these trials, it happens to David. All of these horrible, horrible things are happening to me, but you, God, you accept me. You love me. I hope you've experienced that in your prayer life. It's an amazing thing to experience. It's that understanding that in the midst of all of that tumult, that God is there to be the shoulder to lean on, to be the ear to listen to you, to be the rock onto which you crumble. But He's there, always. I hadn't really planned on sharing this, but today being Father's Day, it's and I think if a lot of fathers are going to be honest with themselves, that's how mothers like the flowers and all the handmade things. Fathers, they like the ties, but maybe go away. That's not entirely true. I would love to be with my family, but it is also nice to have some Chris time. But the reason I bring it up is each holiday over the last almost year has been another reminder that Carter is no longer with us. That happened to Emily and Mother. It happened to me on Mother's Day too. And Christmas was sort of the big one, but I didn't expect it to affect me. Really, I thought, no, I really miss him. But everyone's right. It takes a good 3 years for you to get completely over that. But yesterday, I went to Lafayette where I saw Peggy, Mary, and Drew, and I went to check out a sale that they were having in Express, and there was a father, and he was with his son, and he was pushing a wheelchair, and that hit me. That was a big realization. I would love to be able to be pushing Carter through the mall. I would love that. And so then I always try to look into the future. I always try to anticipate things. That way my reality, whatever happens, doesn't surprise me or rock me too much. I guess that's probably the pragmatic man that lives inside of me. But and I'm sure plenty of you do it. But and so my mind, after I sort of pulled myself together, my mind went to, what am I going to possibly do today? If Emily and the kids are having a great time in Arizona, and I have a if I take a look at the picture of all three of the kids, it's hanging around, what happens? Am I just going to collapse? Am I going to crumple? Am I just fall apart and lose it? Maybe. That could very well happen. And quite honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, it's probably going to happen sometime. But you know, when I collapse, when I crumble, God is going to be there. He's always there. Whether or not we want to think about it all the time, whether or not we give credence to the fact that He's always there, He is always there. To be that shoulder upon which to lean. To be that ear that is listening to us. To be our Heavenly Father for us to find shelter in. So as we approach the communion table this morning, I thank you for patience as I didn't have my script before me, but let us give thanks to God, who is in the midst of all of our tumult and offers His presence and companionship in those times. And thanks be to Him for